Well, here you go. Make you co-host. That's looking better. Okay. Sorry for running a little bit late. My computer decided to give up this morning. Or more likely Zoom or the owl or something was on strike. Make you co-host. Oh, that's looking better. Okay. Sorry. YouTube feedback. Okay. Here we go. That's working. Welcome to Neuroccino on the 30th of October. The rules of the game is everyone is welcome to join us and present a paper. And today Annie is going to present a paper on the ventral stream and neurosurgical mapping. Is that correct? And Annie is a postdoc here in Nijmegen at the Max Planck Institute. And without further ado, if you want to share the link in the chat so everyone has the paper, please. And then you can share your screen.
Yes, that's the only thing I haven't prepared. Sorry for that. I'll put it up in a second.
There's always something.
Yeah, but it's very quick. My internet, at least.
But Marcella and Sabrina, is super dark where you are. Is it that early? Are you in a different time zone? No.
No, here it's it's going to rain, I think, but it's super dark outside. Yeah, I'm in Paris.
But here it's raining really, so
wow.
So maybe it's for days.
Right, we got the link. Thanks for that, Annie. If you want to share your screen.
Is that a sufficient size for everybody?
That works on my end, yes.
Cool. Okay, then let's dive into this. As you already summarized briefly, I stumbled across this. It's from last year, but due to literature review I had to do for some of my own stuff, I thought it sounded, at least from the title, very cool that they're doing interdisciplinary data, so looking into brain connectivity, so some imaging data, then the one from intraoperative stimulation, and also taking evidence from disconnection, so when something is damaged, let's say during the operation or because of aphasia, all of this drawing together what that tells us about the different ventral semantic language streams. It is a review, and I thought it's good to have all of the tracks and the current status quo based on this data on the different tracks that we're assuming here. I won't go much into detail about the different models, language models. They are also not doing this review to prove or disprove any of these models. But of course, there's no way really around the Hiccup and Popo model. So the dual stream of language, where we have one so-called what stream and then one how stream. So ventral being the one what we're seeing and then maybe how we're pronouncing it, etc. in the dorsal stream. And this being actually built on the visual dual stream model back to Milner and Godot. They do want to point out, however, of course, that those people, Hiccup and Popo, were not the first ones to assume some kind of dual or division of streams. Wernicke and Lichtheim, etc., already concluded that we can't just be talking about our cortical regions without understanding there's connections that can also be disconnected and what that leads to. So this is definitely already beyond the localization of function in the brain. Other people contributed to this further, leading us to our traditional Wernicke-Lichtheim-Geschwind model. Again, the paper is not really aiming to bring data for or against any of this. What their main purpose is that there's still a quite widespread lack of consensus when it comes to both what we know about our tracks, anatomical definitions, their presumed functions, and most importantly, what models of white matter tracks are underneath all of these cortical hubs of function. So this is why they wanted to pull together data from different backgrounds, methods, etc. And with the aim that all of this might then in the end help neuroclinicians and surgeons, and that's why I'm also presenting it, having a bit more of a clinical background, particularly maybe to have more overview of which tasks to use if we want to interrogate any of those tracks in the OR. That's not the sole goal, but that was one of why this group around a neurosurgeon in London made this review. So that was the overall goal. I got really excited when I read that, but already as a disclaimer, they're not really going into the tasks. This just on the long run, this might be a goal. What they're pointing out as well, and I agree with this, that the white matter tracks and their anatomy and function are often studied separately, and this could be done more in unison. So here they're proposing this comprehensive interdisciplinary synthesis for the tracks that they're already, though, assuming semantic function for. And those tracks are the uncinate, the middle longitudinal, the inferior longitudinal, and the common player, the inferior frontal occipital fascicle. And for each of them, they are giving a little bit of a historical wrap up, a anatomical fiber organization model, and functional considerations from different disciplines also contributing to this. As I said before, they're not doing this to validate any of the models, but just wanted to draw together the data. And also important to point out, we're talking about the left hemisphere. Mostly this is their focus. And it's supplemented by some of their own data from white matter dissections with the Klinger technique. For each of them, there's one example from their lab. Yeah, that's about it. That's the goal of it. And I hope it can lead to a little bit of discussion later, because this is going beyond what I usually look at a level. So it's more detailed than what I'm used to anatomically, for instance. I thought I'll pull up the pictures and I'll summarize it to you in the background without too much scrolling around. Starting with our uncinate fascicle, so a short association bundle. Here you can see in A, the cortical termination, so frontal and temporal. Then below also what our white matter would look underneath, a Klinger version, and also some imaging to support this. To summarize this, when it comes to the lateralization for each of the tracks, they looked into evidence for this. It's very inconclusive for the UF. So if it's more right or left, really depends on which study you were looking into. But what they're pointing out, and here's the stuff that has been unknown to me, that we could be further separating each of these tracks into different segments. So here for the UF, several people have pointed out 3 different segments: a dorsal temporal one, a middle insular one, and a ventral frontal one. Not really important in detail right now. You can look it up yourself in the paper, but possibly they are supporting different function. Overall, the UF is summarized as helping to communicate the phonological and semantic system, also I guess due to where it is. Meaning intraoperatively, when we are stimulating this tract with DES, it sometimes ranges from seeing no errors whatsoever, because possibly the IFOF could compensate, I'll come to that later, but also phonemic paraphasias, so that would be the phonological system being broken down, or errors on object naming, so more so semantic errors, and also face naming. So this has nothing to do with language. Postoperatively, so if this is damaged, we see short-term naming deficits. So they dissolve really quickly. So this recovers for the language part, but maybe not for the face naming part. So overall, some semantic processing for sure, a little bit of an evidence for phonology and something, transcending language such as face naming. Further supported for the semantic part is that often in patients with primary progressive aphasia, this tract is damaged. So for instance, this microstructure is not as intact as in the healthy brain. So for instance, we could have a reduced FA that then leads to long-term and chronic semantic deficits. Our next player, I'll have to scroll a little bit to make it to the ILF. Here we go. once more different visualizations of it. The terminations here being occipital and temporal, for sure, the ones that they're pointing out. And here a clear division they're making right from the beginning, that we have different terminations in the, well, debated visual word form area, and then the visual object form area. This is important for if we then look at the different branches in a bit. It's considered right lateralized, regardless of its subcomponents. It seemed to be more so present in the right hemisphere. And for instance, Catani et al. Pointed out 3 branches of it. Dufault is talking about 4. If again, I would suggest you go into the paper for the details where exactly the terminations are. But what is interesting is the division between the ones that are more anterior and the ones that are more posterior. So the anterior ones, also due to intraoperative data from Dufault, is pointing that towards that part, subpart, having a semantic subfunction. The posterior one, we can further divide it to upper and to lower. It gets a bit complicated, but this is the interesting one of the upper and lower ones in the posterior one, because then we can really see this division between a part that ends in the visual object form area versus the visual word form area. So the visual word form area is then the one, if we stimulate it or if there's anything breaking down, this should have something to do with writing. So in general, the function that they're drawing from all of this is visual input to assigning meaning. And that visual input could be like an object we're trying to decipher, or letters that we're trying to put into reading and decipher that way. So the posterior part is then the reading segment, and intraoperative stimulation here also really leads to alexia, so deficits in regular reading, irregular reading, and so on. Whereas the anterior segment, if we stimulate here, we don't see any reading errors, but phonological errors. It is overall more inconsistent, but this is the division here because of where it ends in the occipital lobe and then stimulation to it, leading to different deficits. Yeah, you could call it different modalities, I guess. Also here they bring up for explaining the inconsistency in these findings, the presence of the IFOV. So since the IFOV could possibly take over in visual naming of an object, that might be the explanation why we don't see very consistent errors during the ILF's object naming, for instance. Yeah, we can discuss it later if you want, but here those branches, 4 branches, but then pulled together into 2 different upper and lower ones, or posterior and anterior ones for anomia versus alexia. This is also supported by VLSM data for both leading to either alexia or naming deficits after operation. Once more, persons with primary progressive aphasia are also named having chronic lexical retrieval deficits in the end. Now, to a new player in the game, the most recent discovery being the MLF. Here we are. I feel like the schematic representation here is a bit thin compared to what the fiber tracking would suggest, but overall, this is a parietal temporal tract. So from the caudal inferior parietal lobule to the STS. We don't know that much about it given its recent discovery, but lots of its assumed function is based on actually data from primates. So we know that in primates, it connects the auditory associations with areas, so with the STG, and is supposedly doing sound comprehension. And from that, people concluded that also it must have something to do in comprehension in humans. Connecting the parts of the parietal to the temporal areas. They are summarizing it here very detailed, and I don't know how exactly they got to this very detailed conclusion of encoding sublexical representations into auditory word form and acoustic phonetics. So kind of assigning it both phonological and semantic function. Data for this is scarce. So both from intraoperative and postoperative lesion data. intraoperatively, when we stimulate this tract, there's no language deficit and also no new permanent deficit after the operation, only very temporary anomia and some semantic paraphasias, both intraoperative and postoperative. So they're summarizing that we're looking at a more supportive function in language that can be compensated for. Yeah. Then lastly, coming to our very known IFOF, that seems to be absent in non-human primates. That's why it also got so famous for us as an assumed language tract. Yeah, setting us apart from primates. It has 4 lobe terminations, so our surface lobes, I would call them. So the frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal terminations are present. Depending on who we're quoting, again, we're looking at different layers. And I'm looking forward to what you guys think about that. Different people claiming different subparts, but in general, I would summarize it as in there is a superficial part to it, or dorsal, it is sometimes called, and a deep one. So you have to go more inwards to find it. Another group of people pointed out 4 layers where you subdivide it further. But I think what I liked that they pointed out here is the big variability between people when we're trying to find it and to stimulate it. So they really call it a substantial amount of variability. So some of these terminations are really consistently found in everybody, for instance, in the IFG, but many more players being much more inconsistent. So really depending on who you're looking at, if you're finding them or not. This is when it comes to lateralization, it depends on which projections we're talking about. In the right hemisphere, the more lateral ones are present. In the left, the more medial ones. And now the most interesting part, I guess, is coming to its function. As I said before, this is the most famous one and also the one, the big player of semantic processing. Particularly for object discrimination, so really this visual part of, and then being able to name it. Due to its frontal lobe terminations, so parts of the IFOF integrating possibly dorsal and ventral stream info, it might have, Stephanie's shaking her head, I'm looking forward to which parts she doesn't agree with. So its terminations, due to having so many terminations also in the frontal lobe, there's not just verbal object naming, but also possibly non-verbal semantics, so some kind of integration from different modality. Moreover, because this executive functioning is so strongly done in the frontal lobe, it's assumed that it also plays a role in that. Whereas in the right hemisphere, visual spatial function comes in. Now, data coming from intraoperative mapping points out that it's extremely reproducible to show semantic paraphasias of very different kinds. So different subsets of linguistic skills being disrupted semantic linguistic skills at different terminations, different endparts of the IFOF. And here its multimodal role comes in. This is also driven by intraoperative data from Dufault's team. So we could see both anomias, so really semantic paraphasias and anomias on verbal tasks. So you're supposed to say out loud what you're seeing, a picture of an apple, but also these non-verbal tasks. That means you have 4 pictures and then a 5th picture, and you have to match your 5th picture to the other ones and point at it. I wouldn't call this like non-linguistic. There's definitely lots of linguistics going on, but not saying it out loud. And here we're now can relate this to our different layers and also the different hemispheres. They're not saying this, but I know that Dufault points out that the non-verbal semantics are heavily in the right hemisphere. But coming back to the data here, the superficial layer, the one we first meet when we enter the brain, especially in the OR, is then the one for the verbal modality, whereas the deep one, the deep layer would be the non-verbal semantics. As a little fun, little extra case report towards the end, there's also found IFOF's involvement in reading, leading to transient alexia. That's very scarce data, though. And postoperatively, that's the one I think is a stronger evidence. So when it's disconnected, either by a tumor or by stroke, it leads to semantic processing deficits. But also, so for classical naming, also intraoperatively, if we stimulated some issues with dyslexia, but in general, yeah, the language part, it seems to be, sorry, the reading and writing part, it seems to be sharing with the ILF. Yeah, and in the right, we're looking more at spatial neglect. This is it for all the different tracks. Let's see what all of this brought us, this overview. In the concluding remarks, they point out that they have established that there's a more integratory function for both dorsal and ventral stream info in the UF. Also, it seems to be much more distributed than assumed before, so more endpoints in the anterior temporal lobe. And that is also true for all the other tracks, that overall we're just more aware of the distributed terminations, the IFOF in all 4 lobes, the MLF in the parietal lobe, and the ILF and its different terminations in the occipital lobe, if you remember the visual word form area and the visual object form area. But yet they end in saying that we still have very inconsistent data for the UF. We still don't know what exactly the IFOF, how it compensates for the ILF or the UF. Definitely lacking data for the MLF, and the multimodality of the IFOF is also, not greatly supported by a lot of data. Overall, still, they wanted all of this to, as a goal to be able to maximize preservation postoperatively. And they do end by saying, let's not just use object naming for all these tracks with their different subfunctions, various subfunctions, but they don't go any further into pointing which track to use for what. That's it. That's a big, a little bit of an overview of what we assume what the status quo is, at least 1.5 years ago. And a little bit to spark conversation, I would love to hear from your side what you think of those different subparts of the tracks. I have never really worked with them, nor do I know outside of the clinical world how big they are. And particularly, maybe the provocative statement here could be, of course, the more subparts we give or discover, the more easy it is then to disentangle inconsistent findings. So if we stimulate different parts of the ILF and then have different errors, of course, if they are in itself consistent errors, that would be great to really establish subparts. But I was just wondering what people think about that. I do think they could have drawn more data from lesion literature. It was much, much more intraoperative than it sounded like in the introduction. And I do think they didn't want to validate the dual stream model, but they are already assuming a lot by, their title alone. And it's all the semantic function they're trying to point out. So they're not particularly supporting the Hickok-Popo model, but I think it's omnipresent in everybody's mind. Yeah, that's it. Happy for
Lovely, thank you. Are there questions? Not yet, so I'm gonna, Eduardo.
Just about what you were saying. So first of all, which are the criteria to define a support of a white matter fiber? In this case, do they provide a definition?
Sorry, how they define the terminations?
No, did they find? How do they decide that a certain white matter bundle should be divided into more subparts? Because
that's a good question. I mean, for the very famous subdivision of, I'm trying to find if there's one where they actually show it. I think mostly through stimulation in this case. I'm not sure if how much this is supported from the imaging side. So this is really during the operation when you first hit one layer, then you go deeper and you find a different type of error on the deeper level. I'm sure that this is also through the Klinger. I think this is also must be, solely anatomical by the clinoid dissections, but they are not defining this. They're not giving a definition. That would be in the papers they're quoting, I suppose. Good question.
This is a general issue that we have in the field, and that's the question: how do you actually define a tract? Do they have to go through the same part, like through the same bottleneck, as we can see in this image? That would be the external extreme capsule. Or do they have to connect the same cortical areas but can take a different trajectory? And different schools have different ways of determining how to define a tract, and that's also partially why you get those different segments of the tract. The other thing is that Klingler validation used to be considered the gold standard to validate tractography, but actually the limitations of Klingler are akin to the limitations of tractography, and that is that you don't have a good resolution getting closer to the cortex, for example. So with tractography, your FA drops as you get closer to the cortex, so you can't really, with most sequences, you can't really see determination points per se. So the way you do it is you show the white matter underneath, and then you extend it to show the cortical projections. With Klingler, by definition, you have to peel away the cortex to get to the white matter. So again, you have an indirect estimate of where those connections are going to. And the other thing about the separation of the tracts is that Klingler works in a way that you freeze and you thaw the brain multiple times. And that can potentially, given that there's a lot of water in the brain, when you freeze the water, it turns into ice, it expands. When you thaw it, it melts again. So you have this potentially artificial expansion and contraction of the white matter, which may or may not induce some artifactual divisions between white matter connections, or push together white matter that in the living human brain isn't actually clustered together. So these are the kind of limitations that you have on both sides, and that's why those of you working closely with me know that I keep saying that we don't actually know what the brain looks like, because we don't have a method that is 100% reliable in showing the anatomy, and that then all feeds into how do you define a different tract. Lilith, sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, well, but it's just 1 minute left. Quick question. So Dufault, he also had like a map of white matter tracts, and he also do a lot of intraoperative stimulations. So question, are those two models coincide, or are they totally different? Do they discuss this?
You mean his model that he's suggesting for the left? I mean, he has lots of data and only intraoperative. This is not contradicting that, no.
So they say so they basically, because the other one was published in 2014 maybe, and this one is 2022. So I was wondering if they just expanded or just re-evaluate the same things and then see some contradictions, or
I mean, this is not the Dufault group. That's not.
That's why I'm asking. Like, did they discuss?
They take one of the source. They take his lab's work as one of the sources of data to work, but they don't put anything oppose any of those models. They draw from him mostly, then from a lot of Catani's work, but none of it is contradictory in that sense. Only when it comes to division, the subdivisions of the tracks. So further going into detail.
Well, thank you. But yeah, if there is still time, I can ask another question. But if it's already 10,
go for your question.
Okay, so the question is, so they wrote that Wernicke went beyond localization perspective, right? So he started to talk about connections, but then still, does it actually differ from localization perspective? Just now we are localizing different functions to specific white matter tracts. And also the method of intraoperative one is we are just associating one damage to one symptom. So this is it actually different from what Broca described?
I think more comprehensive by now, but I agree.
But I mean, in terms of methodologically and theoretically in that way.
I always like simulation mapping. I like what you can do with it, but I like the notion of it being the gold standard and how this now explains everything just because we can stimulate it. Stephanie always points out in detail that if we're simulating certain areas of the brain, we don't even know which track we're hitting at the moment.
Exactly.
No determination. So yeah, but that was not your point.
No, it was exactly the point. Yeah, because when they say they went beyond localization, I don't feel it. It seems the same, but more. It's true. It's like a lot of valuable information we're getting from this, but I'm not sure if we are interpreting these correctly and assigning each white matter to specific symptom is not
agreed.
Probably the picture.
It has the name direct in the name direct electrical stimulation because we are on the.
Yeah, that's cool, but yeah.
But I do agree the assumptions are still very indirect. It's not a one-to-one mapping of stimulation and function, and it's very distributed.
Yeah, thank you.
You're actually tapping into a very long debate now, but let's see if I can make this short enough. So yes, if you assign one function to one tract, it's the same idea as localizationism, where you would define one function to one cortical area. And it will come with exactly the same limitations that you have with localizationism. And we try to highlight that a bit in our recent review, where we showed that if you have this one-to-one mapping, the computational power that gives you in a modular system is very limited. And then you bring in the white matter and you have a more hierarchical system, but the computational power is still extremely limited and wouldn't be sufficient to explain complex functions like language in the human brain. So you're definitely spot on with that critique. The other thing is that we just have a mapping issue, right? We're trying to map very minute linguistic components like semantic paraphasias or phoneme errors to a network in the brain, and maybe that dimension just doesn't actually map well onto each other. The third point is that we have yet to see the validation of the IFF being a semantic pathway, because they tend to stimulate, and this is partially driven by the location of the tumors, of course, and how much you can actually open the skull to stimulate. But most of the stimulation studies, surgical stimulation studies, they stimulate somewhere in the posterior temporal inferior parietal region. And Annie has just shown us all those images that is actually an area of crazy overlap between white matter pathways. So you have more than 3-4 fiber populations that actually cross over. Now, when you stimulate these fibers, we always show them as nice distinct bundles with tractography, but really they're intermingled, right? So when you stimulate in such a hub, you can't really be sure which tract you're stimulating. And the idea in a network framework would be, it doesn't matter where along the tract you stimulate if that network is important for a given function. So if you get semantic errors stimulating in the parietal lobe, but the IFF, then you should also get semantic errors if you stimulate somewhere further along behind the temporal or in the frontal lobe, and that we haven't seen yet. And we know that this posterior temporal inferior parietal area is a difficult area, because most surgeons that I spoke to, they said they can take Broca's area out and it's fine, people recover, but they can't take out that posterior temporal inferior parietal area because they won't recover. And that, I think, is at least in part due to that overlapping of connections and tapping into various networks rather than one or two. But that is a very long discussion I'm happy to have with all of you over coffee. But it's time to call it a day for Neuroccino. But let's discuss that in more detail maybe when we're sitting together with the lab and come back to it. One note I wanted to make is that the IFOF has been described in the primate brain by now. That was work done by Roger Maas, who was able to show with tractography that the IFOF is in the primate brain.
So we're not suspicious.
Whether or not that is a true tract is a different story, but we can replicate it across species. So that has been done. And for those of you who were at SNL, we now know about the archaeid as well. So exciting times. Right. That's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us on this Monday morning. And I shall see you next week, Monday morning, 9:30. Thank you. Bye.
Stephanie, just one thing. Should we stop discussing, like, because I cannot be there tomorrow for the
Yeah, just hang back.
Okay.
And we have a chat.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.